quote, "It was black as dark. When the Japs hit, the darkness became almost as bright as day. A wall of fire poured from our lines." End of quote. Sid Phillips was a 19-year-old Marine on Guadalcanal in August 1942 when he watched the Ichiki detachment, nearly 1,000 of the Japanese Army's best soldiers, attack the Marine perimeter along the Tenaru River in the middle of the night. The Japanese had waded across the river in total darkness, quietly, in a formation they had rehearsed for exactly this kind of operation. They expected to find sleeping Americans in unprepared positions. What they found instead was a defensive line that erupted with a volume of fire so immediate and so accurate that by morning, the Ichiki detachment had ceased to exist. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture. Then he shot himself. The Japanese had been trained to own the night. For the entire preceding decade, the Imperial Japanese Army had been developing night combat as a specific tactical advantage. Their training manuals, the classified materials bound in red paper and known to the Japanese officer corps as the Red Books, emphasized attacks at night, in the evening, and at dawn. The doctrine had been built to counter an enemy with more tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft. In darkness, those advantages disappeared. In darkness, the battle became about discipline, stealth, and the willingness to close with the enemy at bayonet range. The Japanese believed they had more of all three than any Western army. They were wrong about the Marines. The Marines had built something the Red Books did not account for: a system. The system began with the foxhole rule. After dark, on every island from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the standing order in Marine positions was absolute. Nobody moves. If a Marine needed to relieve himself, he did it in his foxhole. If he needed water, he drank what he had. If he heard a sound 10 feet in front of his position, he did not investigate. He threw a grenade. The rule was enforced with a simple logic. After dark, anyone up and moving in the Marine perimeter was Japanese. There were no exceptions. Marines who forgot this rule died, sometimes killed by their own men, and the survivors never forgot it again. If you're watching this and finding it interesting, it would mean a lot if you hit subscribe. We make content like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. The second layer was the alarm system. On Guadalcanal, Marines strung barbed wire in front of their positions and attached empty tin cans containing a few pebbles. When a Japanese infiltrator touched the wire, the cans rattled. The sound was small, but in the silence of a jungle night where every Marine in every foxhole was listening with an intensity that turned hearing into something close to a weapon, the rattle of pebbles in a tin can was enough. It told the Marines that something was in the wire and where and when to open fire. The third layer was illumination. When the Japanese launched a full-scale night attack, the Marine defenders called for star shells, artillery-fired parachute flares that burst overhead and flooded the battlefield with harsh white light. The light lasted 30 to 45 seconds per round, and the Marine mortar and artillery crews could keep them going continuously, one burst after another, turning the battlefield into a flickering, shadow-thrown landscape in which the attacking Japanese, who had counted on darkness to cover their approach, were suddenly visible to every rifleman on the line. Captain Hunt, commanding K Company on Peleliu, described it. "Flares swished up from the rear. I prayed they wouldn't break over our own position and light us up, but they burst well in front of us, flooding the area with light." The fourth layer was the most devastating, and it was the one the Japanese had no answer for. The Marines called artillery fire on their own positions. When a massed Japanese night attack threatened to overrun a section of the line, the Marine forward observer called in artillery shells to impact just yards in front of the foxholes, sometimes directly on top of them. The calculation was simple. The Marines in the foxholes had cover. The Japanese in the open did not. A shell that burst among the attacking Japanese killed the men standing up. The same shell passed over the Marines lying flat in their holes. The technique required extraordinary trust between the infantry and the artillery, because a miscalculation of a few yards would kill Marines instead of Japanese. The trust existed because the Marines trained for it obsessively. The Japanese had not expected any of this. Their doctrine assumed that Western troops would be disoriented, frightened, and passive at night. The Red Books were built on the premise that the Japanese soldier's spiritual training gave him a psychological advantage in darkness that Western materialism could not match. The night attack was supposed to neutralize American firepower by removing the ability to see and aim. The Japanese would close to bayonet range, where individual courage and discipline would decide the fight. The premise failed on contact with the Marine system. The Marines could not see in the dark any better than the Japanese could. They did not need to. The tin cans told them where the attack was coming from. The star shells told them where the attackers were. The foxhole rule told them that anything moving was a target. The artillery told the Japanese that cover of darkness did not mean cover from high explosive. At the Tenaru River on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the system worked for the first time. The Ichiki detachment attacked into a wall of fire that the Marines had been preparing since sunset. By morning, 774 of the roughly 900 Japanese attackers were dead. Marine casualties were 35 killed and 75 wounded. 6 weeks later, at Edson's Ridge, the Kawaguchi detachment attacked the same Marine division with 2,500 men. The Marines held a grass-covered ridge south of Henderson Field, dug in with interlocking fields of fire, barbed wire in front of their positions, and artillery pre-registered on the likely avenues of approach. The Japanese attack came on 2 consecutive nights, September 12 to 13 and 13-14, and on both nights the pattern repeated. Japanese infantry moving through the jungle in darkness, hitting the wire, triggering the alarm systems, and then meeting a volume of fire from Marines who had known they were coming for the last 30 seconds and had spent those 30 seconds getting ready. 600 Japanese were killed on the slopes of the ridge. 40 Marines died. On Peleliu in September 1944, K Company of the 1st Marines held a position called the Point, a coral promontory overlooking the landing beaches. On the first night, the Japanese counterattacked. Private First Class Fox, sharing a foxhole with a buddy, heard movement in front of his position sometime between 11 and midnight. "You could hear movement going about," recalled PFC Swede Hansen, who was nearby, "and your ears got bigger and bigger because you're wondering, is it a Marine or is it a Jap?" Hansen did not wait to find out. He threw hand grenades into the darkness, heard a Nambu machine gun open up in response, and threw more grenades until it stopped. The fight went on through the night. Captain Hunt called for illumination. The flares burst in front of K Company's position. In the sudden light, the Marines could see Japanese soldiers running across the open ground toward them. Hunt gave the order to fire. The fighting lasted until dawn. When morning came, K Company had held the point. Of 235 men, 157 were casualties. 18 men could still carry a weapon. The Japanese attack at Peleliu followed the same doctrinal pattern as the attacks at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. Night movement, massed infantry, the assumption that darkness would neutralize American firepower. The Marine defense followed the same system: foxhole discipline, early warning, illumination, and concentrated fire. The Japanese doctrine had not adapted. The Marine system had been refined, practiced, and drilled into every rifleman in the division until the response to a night attack was automatic, institutional, and lethal. The most dramatic reversal of the night fighting dynamic came at Iwo Jima on March 7, 1945, when the Marines did something the Japanese did not believe they were capable of doing. They attacked at night. Major General Graves Erskine, commanding the 3rd Marine Division, had observed that the Japanese at Iwo Jima had learned the American pattern: heavy bombardment, then infantry advance. Every time the Marines shelled a position and then attacked, the Japanese took cover during the bombardment, emerged when it lifted, and engaged the advancing Marines from prepared positions. Erskine ordered the 9th Marine Regiment to attack in the dark, with no preliminary barrage. The 9th Marines moved forward at 0500 on March 7th into positions that the Japanese had fortified around Hill 3 and 62. The attack achieved total surprise. The Marines reached the Japanese positions before the defenders knew they were coming. Soldiers were killed in their fighting holes while still asleep. The hill was taken with minimal casualties. The capture of Hill 362 was, by the assessment of the Marine Corps' official history, a key turning point in the battle for Iwo Jima. The Japanese organized a counterattack to retake the hill the following night. The counterattack failed. The Marines who had taken the position by stealth now defended it with the same system they had used on every island since Guadalcanal: foxhole discipline, listening posts, illumination, and artillery on call. The Japanese had taught the Marines inadvertently that night attacks could work. The Marines had learned the lesson and applied it against the teachers. The system the Marines built for night combat in the Pacific was not a single innovation. It was a collection of techniques. each one developed in response to a specific problem encountered on a specific island. The tin cans on the wire came from Guadalcanal, where the first night attacks taught the Marines that they needed early warning. The star shell doctrine came from the same campaign, refined through the Solomons and perfected by Paleliu. The artillery on your own position technique was developed at Guadalcanal and used at every subsequent engagement where the Japanese massed infantry for a night assault. The password system, which used words containing the letter L because Japanese speakers had difficulty pronouncing it, was another Guadalcanal innovation that became standard practice across the entire Pacific. Each piece was simple: tin cans, barbed wire, flares, and a rule that said, nobody moves. None of them required technology the Japanese lacked. The Japanese could have strung wire, they could have used alarm systems, they could have called artillery on their own positions. They had the physical capability to build every component of the Marine night fighting system. What they could not replicate was the institutional willingness to build a system out of those components and then drill it into every rifleman until the response to a night attack was reflexive rather than considered. The Japanese night attack doctrine depended on individual courage. The Marine night defense system depended on institutional discipline. Individual courage is powerful but inconsistent. Institutional discipline is repeatable. On every island, every night, the Marines repeated it. The Japanese kept attacking into it, expecting a different result, and the result was the same every time. Sid Phillips, the 19-year-old who watched the Ichiki detachment die in the darkness at the Tenaru River, survived Guadalcanal and came home. He was asked decades later what the fighting was like at night. He described the wall of fire that came from the Marine line when the Japanese hit the wire, the star shells turning the darkness into something bright and terrible, the silence after the firing stopped, the sound of the wounded in the dark, the smell of cordite, and the dead scattered across the sand. What he did not describe, because it was not the kind of thing a 19-year-old thinks about at the time, was the system, the tin cans and the wire and the flares and the foxhole rule and the artillery. He did not think of it as a system. He thought of it as what the Marines did. The Japanese who attacked into it night after night, island after island, year after year, were attacking something they had been trained to believe could not exist, an enemy that fought accurately in total darkness. The enemy could not see any better than they could. The enemy did not need to. The enemy had built a way to fight without seeing, and the Red Books had no chapter for that.